Being buried in a pyramid might sound like the ultimate honor. Eternal rest beneath mountains of stone, protected by sacred geometry and surrounded by treasures. It conjures images of glory, divine kingship, and the afterlife promised only to the most powerful. A monument so grand it could speak across millennia, reminding the world who once ruled beneath the sun. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. But the truth, as always, is far more complicated. In ancient Egypt, being buried in a pyramid wasn't always a privilege. Sometimes it was a political move. Sometimes it was an act of desperation. And sometimes it wasn't a choice at all. The towering tombs we see today may be wonders of engineering, but they're also riddled with stories of ambition, insecurity, and human cost. Let's start at the beginning. Not the mythic age of giant tombs, but with the very first pyramid, the step pyramid of Djoser, around 2667 BCE. It wasn't born out of grandeur for grandeur's sake. It was innovation born of insecurity. Djoser's architect, Imhotep, stacked 6 mastabas, flat-roofed tombs on top of one another. Not just to impress, but to make a point. This king was different. His burial had to shout louder than anyone else's. Because even in death, visibility was power. This tomb wasn't just a monument, it was a signal flare of dominance. What followed was a race to outbuild the past. Pharaohs commissioned pyramids bigger, steeper, and more ambitious, but bigger didn't always mean better. The bent pyramid of Sneferu? A structural nightmare. The builders changed the angle halfway through because it was collapsing under its own weight. Sneferu would build more than one pyramid in his lifetime, perhaps not because he wanted to, but because he had to. The pressure to project strength, even in stone, was relentless. One failed monument could tarnish a ruler's image for eternity. And these projects weren't just expensive, they were devastating. Thousands of workers conscripted from across the land, years of back-breaking labor, entire economies bent toward a tomb. For what? In theory, divine transformation. In practice, politics. A massive pyramid wasn't just a gateway to the afterlife, it was a billboard to the living, a warning to rivals, a legacy carved into the skyline. It said, I ruled, I mattered, and I will not be forgotten. But here's the thing. Even the most impressive pyramid couldn't guarantee peace. Not in life. Not in death. And definitely not for the people forced to build them. These monuments were meant to defy time, but they were born in a world that couldn't. By the time the first pyramid rose from the desert floor, Egypt was already a land fixated on death. Not in a morbid or gory way, but in a spiritual, cosmic, and deeply structured sense. To the ancient Egyptians, the afterlife wasn't just a hopeful idea or a vague mystery. It was a fully imagined and thoroughly documented journey. They believed it had clear destinations, detailed maps, specific trials, and divine checkpoints. Instructions for navigating this next world were laid out in texts like the pyramid texts, coffin texts, and later, the Book of the Dead. Every spell, every rite, every carving on a tomb wall served a purpose, to guide the soul across the threshold into eternity. But there was a brutal catch. This heavenly roadmap wasn't for everyone. Access to the afterlife, with all its splendor and immortality, depended less on moral virtue and more on status, wealth, and proximity to the royal court. The step pyramid of Djoser was where it began, a bold, blocky monument rising from the desert at Saqqara. It wasn't just the first of its kind, it was the opening shot in an architectural arms race that would last centuries. Pharaohs turned to stone not just to outdo their predecessors, but to cement their claim to godhood. In the Egyptian worldview, the pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was a bridge between mortals and the divine, a literal god on earth. But that status wasn't permanent. It had to be affirmed even after death. And how did one prove their divinity? By commissioning something so massive, so mathematically precise, so cosmically aligned that it could only be explained by supernatural favor. To fail in that task wasn't just to fail as a ruler, it was to risk annihilation in the afterlife. The pressure was immense. A cracked pyramid, a misaligned burial chamber, or a collapsed corridor wasn't just a blemish on a legacy, it was potentially catastrophic. The afterlife wasn't guaranteed. It could be denied, interrupted, or sabotaged. That's why some pharaohs built multiple pyramids, not just to impress or dominate the landscape, but to hedge their spiritual bets. One fails, you've got another. Better safe than eternally sorry. This wasn't architecture. It was theological insurance. And still, for all their grandeur, pyramids were hopelessly bad at their primary job, protecting the dead. They were supposed to be impenetrable, sacred fortresses sealed against time. But in reality, most of them were looted within decades. Some even sooner. Grave robbers, driven by greed and sometimes guided by inside knowledge, tunneled through walls, evaded traps, and stripped chambers clean of gold, gems, amulets, and statues. The traps were clever, the passages hidden, but greed was relentless. In most cases, what remained was an empty sarcophagus, desecrated walls, and a name half erased by time and vandalism. This failure gave rise to a deeper, more haunting fear, not just of death, but of erasure. Imagine ruling an empire for decades, only to have your bones scattered by thieves and your monuments left in ruins. The pyramid, designed as a beacon of remembrance, had become a bullseye. To be buried in one didn't mean you'd be remembered forever. It meant you were advertising your wealth to future criminals. And for those who built the pyramids, the workers, artisans, and laborers, the cost was steeper still. They endured punishing heat, injury, and exhaustion. They carved eternal gods into unforgiving stone, shaping someone else's immortality. But most received no recognition, no burial, and no name on any wall. They vanished beneath the sand. Over time, even the pharaohs lost faith in their pyramids. By the New Kingdom, rulers abandoned these towering tombs in favor of hidden burials in the Valley of the Kings. There, deep within the cliffs near Thebes, they placed their bodies behind layers of deception, twisting corridors, false chambers, and no grand structures on the surface to invite trouble. It was a stark shift in tone, from displays of cosmic confidence to strategic invisibility. And as the pyramids stood behind, stripped and echoing, they became symbols not just of spiritual ambition, but of fear, failure, and a growing anxiety about being remembered at all. Because in the end, being buried in a pyramid wasn't always the divine honor it's painted to be. Sometimes it was a desperate gamble. Sometimes it was a statement of fear dressed as certainty. And sometimes, despite all the gold, all the prayers, all the stone, it was just another way to vanish, loudly, spectacularly, and forever. By the time the Old Kingdom reached its peak, the shape of power in Egypt was literally geometric. Pyramids pierced the horizon from Giza to Meidum, etched into the desert like cosmic beacons. But behind the symmetry and grandeur was something far messier. A growing industry of death, belief, and control. These structures weren't just royal tombs, they were declarations. Political, religious, personal. Every block, every angle was laced with meaning. But buried beneath that meaning was a tension, an uneasy awareness that not everyone agreed on what these pyramids really meant, or who truly deserved to be entombed within them. From the outside, a pyramid was a promise. Immortality for the pharaoh, glory for the realm. Order imposed on the chaos of death. But inside, things were less assured. By the Fourth Dynasty, pyramid construction had become a colossal operation. Thousands of workers, years of labor, and staggering amounts of resources. This created resentment. Pharaohs diverted food, manpower, and national attention toward a structure that would serve no one but themselves. The divine justification? That by securing the pharaoh's afterlife, they preserved Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe. But tell that to the farmers pulled from their fields, or the stone haulers whose backs broke under limestone blocks. The social contract was fraying, even as the pyramids rose. What started as an exclusive right of kings began to drift. High officials, priests, and favored nobles started building their own pyramidal tombs. Smaller, sure, but unmistakably inspired by the royal tradition. Suddenly, what was once divine became political. The shape itself became a symbol of status, a way to climb the hierarchy not just in life, but in death. But this democratization of the pyramid brought with it new risks. More pyramids meant more targets, more wealth buried in stone, and more reasons for robbers to learn the trade. Even priests, the supposed guardians of divine truth, got in on the game. Some used their influence to secure pyramidal burials. Others rewrote funerary texts to include themselves. Over generations, the lines blurred. Who was truly worthy of eternity? And who just knew how to game the system? This spiritual inflation had consequences. As more people laid claim to pyramidal legacy, the aura of sacredness eroded. What had once been exclusive became contested. Pharaohs responded by building bigger, stranger, more elaborate pyramids, not just to house their corpses, but to reassert the myth that they alone held divine favor. The Pyramid of Khafra, the Bent Pyramid, the Red Pyramid. Each tried to reclaim the magic, but the magic, like sand, kept slipping through their fingers. And beneath all this ambition was a brutal irony. The more pyramids were built, the more obvious it became that they weren't working. Looters grew bolder. Memory faded faster. Whole names vanished. By the end of the Sixth Dynasty, Egypt would teeter on the brink of collapse. Central authority crumbled. Tombs were raided with impunity. And the pyramid, once a shining promise of eternal order, stood as a silent, empty monument to lost control. So when we imagine pyramids as timeless honors, we're only seeing part of the truth. For some, they were desperate defenses against irrelevance. For others, they were trophies of manipulation. And for the many left unburied, unremembered, and unpaid, they were reminders that even in the afterlife, inequality ruled. Pyramid tombs are iconic, but only a fraction of Egypt's dead were ever entombed in them. And even among those few, being buried in a pyramid didn't always mean eternal honor. It could mean something else entirely. Political desperation, rushed construction, forgotten ambitions, or even an afterlife abandoned and untethered from the divine order the tomb was meant to ensure. By the time Egypt's earliest kings were planning the first pyramid tombs, the idea of commemorating a ruler in stone wasn't entirely new, but the scale and permanence were. The step pyramid of Djoser, rising out of the desert at Saqqara, around 2667 BCE, was a bold architectural and theological statement. Designed by the high priest and architect Imhotep, it broke with centuries of burial tradition. Earlier kings had been buried in mastabas, low, flat-topped tombs built from mud brick, covered in plaster. These were modest, grounded structures. But Djoser's monument was a leap toward the sky, stacked like a giant staircase to eternity. It said, "Here is a man whose memory will not be washed away by wind, time, or dynastic turnover. Here is permanence, carved into limestone." But that ambition brought risk, both cosmic and very practical. Pyramid building was not just expensive in gold, it was perilous in terms of politics, manpower, and sustainability. The bigger the pyramid, the more it strained the kingdom's infrastructure. Quarrying limestone, transporting multi-ton blocks across miles, organizing thousands of laborers, maintaining feeding stations and supply lines, all of it pulled from the treasury, the bureaucracy, and the daily goodwill of workers and citizens alike. A king had to begin his pyramid project early in his reign, sometimes within months of coronation, and hope he lived long enough to see it finished. Dying too soon meant your monument could end up truncated, hastily finished, or entirely abandoned, and some kings did die too soon. Others fell out of favor, politically or religiously. Pyramid projects were scaled back, hastily redesigned, or in some cases reassigned to different royals. In the Fourth Dynasty, the so-called Golden Age of pyramid building, this pressure became extreme. After Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza, which cast a literal and symbolic shadow over Egypt's history, his successors struggled to match its scale and ambition. Khafra came close, but Menkaura's pyramid was noticeably smaller and simpler, not because Egypt lacked the wealth or workers, but because priorities were shifting. Grand tombs were increasingly seen as extravagant risks, potentially provoking the gods, exhausting the people, or inviting envy and revolt. Pyramid building was no longer just piety. It was politics. Even more revealing, some pyramids, though completed with care and reverence, were looted within decades of being sealed. Robbers tunneled through the smooth casing stones and violated inner chambers. The golden death masks, amulets, scrolls, and sacred figurines meant to guide a king's soul into the field of reeds were taken. Sarcophagi were smashed. Mummies were defiled, burned, or vanished entirely. For the ancient Egyptians, that wasn't just criminal. It was catastrophic. The body was the vessel of the soul. Without it, and without an intact tomb, the Ka and Ba, parts of the spirit, could lose their way. So a pyramid, no matter how massive, wasn't eternal. It was a target. By the later dynasties, Egypt had learned the hard lesson. Pyramids were no longer built. They had become relics, monuments to an outdated mode of kingship, power, and divine legitimacy. Later rulers were buried in secret, often in the cliffs and valleys of Thebes, far from public roads or wandering eyes. The Valley of the Kings emerged not as a retreat from majesty, but as a defensive strategy. These tombs weren't meant to be seen from miles away. They were meant to be hidden, guarded by silence and shadow. Because in the end, visibility meant vulnerability. What could be seen could be destroyed. So in Part 4, we'll look deeper into the flip side of pyramid glory. Those whose monuments went unfinished, whose tombs were violated, and whose eternal honor turned into dust, silence, and a legacy buried beneath the very stones meant to preserve it forever. Not every grand pyramid in ancient Egypt was built for a celebrated pharaoh, and not every pharaoh ended up with a grand pyramid. Popular imagination tends to link pyramids with honor, divine legacy, and architectural triumph, but the reality was often more complicated. Being buried in a pyramid wasn't always a sign of success. Sometimes it signaled political instability, an abbreviated reign, or even a desperate effort to appear legitimate. In some instances, the structure became less a symbol of eternity and more a forgotten relic of failed ambition. Part 5 of our series brings us to one of the most intriguing and enigmatic of these monuments, the so-called Lost Pyramid of Abu Rawash. At first glance, the site at Abu Rawash fits the general pattern. A scattered array of large limestone blocks, remnants of a raised structure, and fragments of what might have been a burial chamber. It's rougher, more exposed, and more weathered than its better-known cousins at Giza, but the signature is there. This pyramid has long been attributed to Djedefre, a relatively obscure son of the famous Khufu, the pharaoh responsible for the Great Pyramid. Given that prestigious lineage, one would expect Djedefre's pyramid to reflect similar grandeur and ambition. Instead, it breaks the mold entirely. For starters, its location is unusual. Built far from the ceremonial heart of the Giza Plateau, the Abu Rawash Pyramid stands alone on a barren hilltop, windswept and isolated. This choice raises immediate questions. Was Jedefre distancing himself from his father's legacy, or was he being deliberately excluded? The pyramid itself was also much smaller and cruder in construction. There are signs of rushed workmanship, blocks poorly aligned, corridors half-finished, and a noticeable absence of decorative detail. This wasn't the careful, deliberate craftsmanship of Giza. The reasons behind these differences remain unclear, but several theories have emerged. One suggests that Jedefre sought to make a symbolic break from Khufu, possibly to align himself with the sun cult of Ra, a movement gaining religious influence at the time. Another theory is less charitable. Jedefre may have been pushed aside in a dynastic power struggle, his rule challenged or undermined by rival factions within the court. A third possibility? His reign simply ended too soon, leaving architects and laborers scrambling to complete what they could before his burial. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from what happened after Jedefre's death. Unlike Khufu's tomb, which was venerated and maintained for centuries, Jedefre's pyramid was systematically dismantled. Huge blocks were removed, statues shattered beyond recognition, and reliefs chiseled into obscurity. The destruction was so thorough, it was clearly intentional. To many scholars, this points to posthumous disgrace. Jedefre's memory, it seems, was deliberately erased from the official narrative. This tells us something critical about pyramid burials in ancient Egypt. They weren't always the capstone of a successful reign. Sometimes they were built out of obligation or left incomplete due to internal strife. And sometimes they were targets of revenge or erasure. A pyramid could serve as a monument to power, but it could just as easily become a cautionary tale, a broken stone echo of a king whose memory wasn't worth preserving. In Jedefre's case, the tomb built in haste became a symbol of impermanence, of ambition undercut by politics and time. So when we picture Egypt's pyramids rising proudly against the desert sky, we should remember that not all of them were built in glory. Some were built in desperation. Some were meant to deceive, and some, like the lost pyramid of Abu Rawash, were never truly allowed to stand. In ancient Egypt, burial didn't just reflect how you lived, it reflected how the living wanted you remembered or forgotten. By the time the Pyramid Age was in full swing during Egypt's 5th and 6th dynasties, the practice of royal burial had started to evolve, not just architecturally but ideologically. While the 4th dynasty pyramids, like those at Giza, were all about overwhelming size, imposing grandeur, and asserting divine authority through sheer scale, later pharaohs shifted their focus. Their pyramids were noticeably smaller, their complexes more compact, and their emphasis fell increasingly on inscriptions, spiritual rituals, and intricate cosmic symbolism. The brute monumentality of earlier structures faded into something more refined and symbolic. And with that change came a reimagining of purpose, not just what the pyramid was, but who it was for. What had once been the exclusive afterlife domain of a single god king began to expand and crowd. We begin to see family members, court officials, elite scribes, and even priests being granted burial spots within or adjacent to pyramid complexes. In some cases, they received their own miniature pyramids. In others, they were interred in subsidiary tombs that flanked the primary structure. On the surface, this looked like a generous royal gesture, bringing loyal subjects closer to divine presence and power in death. But scratch beneath that polished limestone surface, and a more complicated story emerges. These burials weren't always honors in the way we might assume. They were sometimes political, sometimes transactional, and quite often a sophisticated form of crowd management. There was a practical element at play here, too. Egypt's expanding population and increasingly intricate bureaucracy demanded a more extensive administrative class. The pharaoh couldn't rule alone. He needed scribes, advisors, overseers, temple staff, and a whole hierarchy of elite professionals to keep the divine machinery of the state running smoothly. Rewarding these individuals with burial near the king reinforced loyalty and maintained the social pyramid. Pun intended. But it also came with strings attached. These tombs often bore inscriptions that didn't merely commemorate the dead, but outlined duties they were expected to perform in the afterlife. Tasks could include guarding the king, offering ritual support, or serving him as eternal laborers. In other words, being buried close to the pharaoh didn't guarantee a peaceful rest. It might mean an eternity of work. Simultaneously, Egypt was undergoing sweeping religious transformations. The solar cult of Ra was gaining unprecedented influence. Temples dedicated to the sun god began to rise alongside pyramid complexes, and the priests of Ra became increasingly powerful figures within society. This wasn't merely a spiritual realignment. It was a calculated political strategy. By elevating Ra to a dominant position in the religious hierarchy, the kings of the Fifth Dynasty could symbolically bind themselves to a more universal, cosmic order. But in doing so, they also had to share divine real estate. The pyramid, once a solitary beacon of royal divinity, became part of a broader celestial ecosystem, one in which the king was still divine, but not alone. So, if you were an elite fortunate enough, or perhaps politically maneuvered enough, to be buried near a pyramid during this era, your tomb might indeed have been a sign of royal favor. But it also might have been a carefully crafted tool of propaganda. It could symbolize protection, or it could signal obligation. It might have been an honest honor or a cunning containment strategy. The boundary between reward and responsibility grew hazy in the desert sands, and the closer you were to the pharaoh in death, the more enmeshed you became in the ideological and administrative machinery of the state, eternally tethered to its divine framework. In the end, being buried near a pyramid wasn't always about personal glory or reverence. Sometimes it was about utility. Sometimes it was about control. And more often than not, it was about making sure that even in death, no one truly escaped the reach of the kingdom. Egypt was a civilization that bound the living and the dead together in a seamless continuum. And in that system, not even the grave offered a final release. As the old kingdom edged closer to collapse, the sands around Egypt's pyramids held more than just kings and courtiers. They held signs of a system straining under its own weight. By the end of the Sixth Dynasty, Egypt was not the unified, God-touched machine it once appeared to be. Droughts had gripped the land, the Nile's floods had grown erratic, and central authority was beginning to fracture. This unraveling had consequences not just for the living, but for the dead, and for the business of burial itself. Royal tombs, once the pinnacle of sacred architecture, were now smaller, cheaper, and sometimes left unfinished. Resources were spread thin, and so was reverence. The pyramid complex no longer represented absolute divine control. It was becoming real estate. Land near these monuments was parceled out, not just to elites, but to anyone who could offer loyalty, labor, or wealth in return. Tombs multiplied like city blocks, and burial near a king no longer meant proximity to divinity. It meant navigating a competitive, transactional landscape. Worse still, the sanctity of these spaces started to erode. In some cases, tombs were looted not by outsiders, but by those within the system: priests, officials, even caretakers. The trust that had once underpinned eternal service gave way to desperation. Gold, statuary, and sacred goods disappeared into private hands or black markets. Inscriptions and rituals lost their weight when the temples meant to uphold them were crumbling. Yet, even in this decline, the machine of ideology kept humming. People still sought burial near pyramids, still inscribed prayers to Ra and Osiris, still imagined an afterlife of order, even if that order was slipping. The state, even in retreat, continued to use burials as leverage. Want a spot near the sacred precinct? Pledge loyalty, donate resources, marry into the right family. Death was no longer just the end. It was a negotiation. By the time regional governors, nomarchs, began carving out their own tombs and claiming divine honors, the writing was on the wall. Power had decentralized. Pyramid fields turned into overcrowded archives of ambition. What was once sacred ground had become a political arena, a statement of status more than spirituality. Burial near a pyramid, in this twilight of the Old Kingdom, was less about eternity and more about survival, of memory, of legacy, of political capital. The pyramid had started as a ladder to the heavens. Now it was a platform, and everyone was scrambling for a foothold. With the Old Kingdom crumbling and centralized authority evaporating, Egypt entered a long and uncertain chapter in its history known as the First Intermediate Period. This wasn't just a breakdown in leadership, it was a collapse in meaning. The once mighty institutions that anchored Egyptian life, the monarchy, the priesthood, the idea of divine order itself, were shaken to their foundations. The pyramid, that enduring symbol of God-king power, became less a testament to eternity and more a reminder of a past no one could quite revive. Power splintered. Where once there had been a single pharaoh ruling from a centralized capital, now there were many rulers, regional governors known as nomarchs, each carving out their own sphere of influence. These figures claimed divine association in their own right, building tombs filled with royal-style iconography and inscriptions. They didn't construct monumental pyramids, but they created elaborate rock-cut tombs and sanctuaries, often echoing the language of the divine kingship. The pyramid as a form didn't disappear, but its meaning did. What was once a sacred architectural covenant between heaven and earth now sat in ruins, its stone scavenged, its purpose questioned. Still, nostalgia is a powerful force. Egyptians of the time looked back on the Old Kingdom as a golden age, a time of abundance, order, and unquestioned spiritual hierarchy. This collective memory sparked a kind of cultural yearning. When the Middle Kingdom eventually rose from the chaos and restored centralized rule, its pharaohs didn't innovate. They imitated. They revived pyramid construction, not out of necessity, but out of ideology. They sought to resurrect the imagery and ritual trappings of the past, to give their reigns legitimacy and stability. These Middle Kingdom pyramids, however, told a different story. They lacked the sheer scale and permanence of their Old Kingdom ancestors. Often built with mud brick cores and faced with thinner layers of limestone, they were more vulnerable to decay and theft. Many have collapsed or eroded beyond recognition. Their surrounding mortuary complexes were also more constrained, less expansive in scale, but more systematic in function. The message wasn't cosmic grandeur. It was bureaucratic continuity. Burial practices adapted accordingly. Where once only the pharaoh and his closest inner circle could expect to be entombed near a pyramid, the Middle Kingdom opened up access to a broader swath of officials, administrators, and favored servants. Burial became a state-sponsored incentive. You didn't need royal blood. What you needed was loyalty, service, and usefulness to the crown. A competent administrator, a military commander, or a skilled temple scribe could now be granted a place near the royal tomb. But this proximity still came at a cost. The tombs weren't just rewards, they were obligations. Inscriptions found in many of these tombs contain formulaic prayers and declarations that reinforce allegiance to the state and the pharaoh, even in death. The ideal afterlife wasn't a personal paradise, it was eternal service within the state's cosmic machinery. You didn't just rest. You represented. Your tomb was a mouthpiece, projecting royal ideology into eternity. And even this system showed strain. As the Middle Kingdom wore on, the cracks became visible. Pyramid construction became more formulaic, and less durable. Funerary texts became more prescriptive and less personal, and the political messaging often rang hollow when the structures meant to deliver it were already beginning to crumble. Many of these tombs and pyramids have survived only as ruins, fragments of a recycled idea that never quite recaptured its original potency. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, being buried near a pyramid had transformed completely. It was no longer an exclusive spiritual honor. It was a calculated move in a broader political chess game. The pyramid served as both symbol and stage, a platform for reinforcing the state's power and reminding the living of their place within its hierarchy. Eternity, in this system, wasn't about individual salvation. It was about continuity, and that meant, whether you were king or scribe, your tomb served the story of Egypt, not the story of you. So, once again, burial near a pyramid wasn't just about reverence. It was about message control. It was about the visual and ideological management of memory. The sacred precincts had become a state apparatus, and in a civilization obsessed with order, the afterlife was just another extension of the bureaucracy that ruled the living. Being buried near the pharaoh was less about resting in glory, and more about doing your part, forever. By the time Egypt emerged into the Middle Kingdom, the grandeur of pyramid building had shifted gears again. The colossal structures of the Old Kingdom were long gone, their stones often stripped for other projects, their symbolic weight fading into myth. But the ideology, the idea that a pyramid could elevate one's status in both life and death, still lingered. Only now, it wasn't just pharaohs who dabbled in divine architecture. The rising elite had joined the game. Provincial governors, military commanders, wealthy scribes. They all started building tombs that mimicked elements of the royal pyramid complex. Some added tiny pyramidal superstructures atop their burial chambers. Others carved tombs with texts that borrowed heavily from the pyramid texts, previously reserved only for kings. This was more than flattery. It was ambition made solid. As central authority weakened again, the elite stepped into the ideological vacuum and reshaped the afterlife narrative around themselves. This democratization of divine symbolism brought new layers of complexity and contradiction. On one hand, it reflected social mobility. On the other, it signaled a dilution of sacred tradition. If everyone could claim pyramid symbolism, what did it mean to be buried near one anymore? The exclusivity that once defined proximity to pyramids was dissolving. The dead were crowding in, architecturally, ideologically, and even spiritually. Even more telling were the architectural changes. Middle Kingdom pyramids, built for kings like Senusret II and Amenemhat III, were more about disguise than display. Hidden burial chambers, complex traps, and deceptive layouts were the norm. Why? Because tomb robbing had become expected. These weren't just places of honor anymore. They were fortresses. Being buried in a pyramid had become risky business. Kings were no longer flexing power with towering stone. They were concealing, defending, hiding. That's not divine confidence. That's fear wrapped in limestone. In short, the meaning of pyramid burial had shifted again. It was no longer about towering over the desert in eternal glory. It was about navigating a competitive, unstable, and sometimes dangerous landscape of legacy. Burial near or in a pyramid had become a gamble, a blend of ambition, tradition, and damage control. For the Middle Kingdom elite, death was still political, still performative, and still deeply uncertain. And so the pyramid, once a pure symbol of divine ascension, had become something else entirely, a contested space where memory, status, and fear collided. The afterlife was still the goal, but the path to it was looking less like a straight line to the stars, and more like a scramble through a crumbling maze of old beliefs and new realities. The pyramids didn't disappear. They just faded into the background. By the time scribes were scrawling spells onto the inside of commoners' coffins and priests were debating the logistics of the afterlife like bureaucrats haggling over temple budgets, those massive stone triangles had become less a gateway to eternity and more a nostalgic silhouette on the desert horizon. The skyline still bore their outline, but their meaning had dulled. What once symbolized the divine ladder to the heavens had turned into oversized landmarks for a belief system under quiet renovation. In the Middle Kingdom, Egypt hadn't lost its obsession with death. It had just learned to systematize it. The grandeur of the Old Kingdom was replaced by controlled order. Pharaohs still commissioned pyramids, but they weren't trying to build wonders anymore. They were managing legacy. These pyramids were smaller, protected, and designed to look legitimate without the excess. More fortress than beacon. They reflected a shift in priorities. Where once death was about displaying power, it had become about preserving order. The grandeur gave way to procedure. What really changed was the paperwork. The Book of the Dead hadn't yet fully arrived, but its ancestors, collections of coffin texts and early spells, were crawling across tomb walls and sarcophagi like divine code. There was a sense that the afterlife was no longer automatic. You had to earn it by getting your lines right. The afterlife had turned into a maze of recitations and ritual fine print. Instead of being swept into the sky with Ra, you needed spiritual credentials. This wasn't a mystical journey anymore. It was a bureaucratic one. The checklist grew long. Say the correct words. Carry the correct amulets. Face the 42 judges with the right heart and an honest resume. Forget divine birthright. This was about navigating a supernatural filing system. Even nobles and high officials were hiring specialists to get the rituals right. You needed a priest, a scribe, a tomb architect, and a few backup plans. Eternity was becoming the domain of organized religion and social capital. If you couldn't afford the full package, you might find yourself wandering the Duat without a map. And as for the pyramids, still iconic, still monumental, they were no longer the front lines of Egyptian religious thought. The sacred energy had shifted. Now, it flowed through temples dedicated to Osiris, the god of the underworld, whose story wasn't about ascension, but about death, dismemberment, and resurrection. That story resonated more. It had drama, vulnerability, and judgment. And it made room for the idea that kings weren't untouchable. They were accountable. This shift in spiritual ideology transformed burial culture. Tomb robbing, which had always lurked beneath the surface, became a louder fear. Laws cracked down. Curses were etched into stone to ward off thieves and desecrators. Priests weren't just caretakers. They were guardians of a moral and legal system built to protect not just the dead, but the entire cosmological structure Egypt depended on. A broken tomb was no longer just a crime. It was a theological disruption. And what of those still buried near the pyramids? Their proximity meant something, but less than before. It was no longer about sharing in the king's eternal aura. It was about signaling prestige, clinging to the outer rings of a former spiritual capital. It was ceremonial adjacency, a kind of spatial virtue signaling. You might still impress the living, but the gods? They had moved on. In short, the pyramid didn't vanish. It got rebranded. From divine launchpad to legacy branding tool. From the beating heart of royal eternity to a kind of spiritual logo slapped on the ancient equivalent of retirement brochures. Egypt had evolved. Its dead had new forms to fill out, new gods to appease, and new hierarchies to navigate. Honor, in the old sense, had dissolved into ritual maintenance. And still, someone was keeping records. Somewhere in the cool shade of a temple archive, a scribe was logging another name, another tomb, another spell sequence. The pyramid stood silent, but the afterlife, it was humming with paperwork. Forget everything you think you know about pyramid burials by the time Egypt hit its imperial stride. The new kingdom didn't scrap the old system. It buried it. Literally. Royal tombs were no longer public monuments to eternal kingship. They were stealth operations. Hidden in the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, they vanished into the rock, protected by misdirection. Deep corridors and the hope that the sands of time would hide them from thieves. This wasn't just a change in architecture. It was a total reimagining of what it meant to rule, die, and be remembered. The days of proclaiming divine status through a sun-drenched stone mountain were over. Pharaohs knew the fate of Giza, looted, exposed, vulnerable. So instead of reaching toward the heavens, they reached inward, downward. Death was no longer a spectacle. It was a covert ritual. This new burial philosophy wasn't just driven by fear of robbery. It reflected a deeper shift in how Egypt viewed kingship and the afterlife. Power was now maintained through control, administration, and spectacle in life, not in death. The bureaucracy grew. Temples expanded. Scribes multiplied. The divine was less about being a walking god and more about being a CEO of cosmic order. And when you died, your tomb became less a monument to status and more a vault of coded symbolism and spiritual engineering. Meanwhile, the pyramids themselves became historic artifacts. They crumbled, faded, eroded, and sank under sand. Once polished and gleaming, they now looked haunted. People still looked at them with awe, but more the kind of awe reserved for ancient wreckage. They were no longer tools of religious dominance. They were museum pieces, reminders of when kings thought stone could outlast time. And yet they weren't entirely forgotten. Some elites, nostalgic or opportunistic, tried to capture a piece of that vanished prestige. Across Egypt and into Nubia, small pyramids sprang up, not as cosmological gateways, but as symbols of identity and loyalty to tradition. These mini-pyramids lacked the cosmic ambition of their old kingdom ancestors. They were gestures, style over substance, a nod to the past, not a claim to its divine machinery. The real spiritual action had moved underground. Tombs became deeply personal, even theatrical. Walls lit up with color and narrative. Gods appeared in procession. Spells flowed like maps across every surface, and central to it all was the Book of the Dead. Not a single book, but a customizable set of scrolls, incantations, and spiritual tools tailored to the deceased. If pyramids were the bold proclamation of godhood, the new kingdom tomb was a dossier, a detailed argument for why the soul deserved to live forever. Each section of the Book of the Dead prepared the traveler for a different obstacle in the duat, the shadowy underworld filled with gates, guardians, trick questions, and trials. Hearts were weighed against feathers. Monsters lurked in lakes of fire. Failure meant obliteration. Success meant paradise. But unlike earlier periods, this wasn't limited to kings. Anyone with enough wealth, knowledge, and connections could commission their own spiritual toolkit. So when someone arranged to be buried near an ancient pyramid during the New Kingdom, it didn't automatically mean they held cosmic clout. It was more like building a modern home next to a crumbling castle. It looked prestigious. It felt prestigious. But its power was symbolic, not functional. The real magic, the real stakes, were happening elsewhere. By now, burial had become an entire industry. Tomb workers, painters, priests, embalmers, amulet makers, and scroll scribes worked in tandem. Some specialized in protective curses. Others painted the deceased wearing fine linen and breathing in the sacred scent of blue lotus. Death was a collaborative production, and if you could afford the full experience, you got a shot at navigating the afterlife's intricate bureaucracy. And still, the pyramids stood, faded, looted, eroded, but unmistakable. They cast a long shadow, not of power, but of memory, a ghost of what burial used to be when divine kingship needed geometry to prove its permanence. Now, all that remained was the silhouette. The pyramid had become a brand, hollow, recognizable, influential in theory, but empty in practice. And the afterlife? It was no longer a royal domain, it was a process, a system, a set of instructions that had to be followed exactly. Burial wasn't about proximity to stone anymore. It was about precision, preparation, and paperwork. The pyramid was no longer the gateway. It was a logo on the brochure. If you fast forward to the late period of ancient Egypt, what you find isn't a decline. It's a remix. The pyramids had become ancient history even to the ancient Egyptians. The awe was still there, but it had shifted into something like reverence for an antique. The original purpose of pyramids, cosmic power, royal afterlife, celestial alignment, had all been rewritten, reinterpreted, or forgotten. By now, foreign dynasties were calling the shots. Libyans, Nubians, and eventually Persians, each took turns wearing the pharaonic crown, and with them came new burial practices, new theology, and an evolving sense of identity. But even as the politics shifted, the pull of the past never quite let go. Some rulers tried to resurrect old traditions, borrowing pyramid shapes, mimicking temple layouts, and referencing long-dead gods. It wasn't revival, it was branding, a signal that despite change, the soul of Egypt still pulsed under the sand. Tombs of the late period were more compact, but more densely packed with meaning. Burial wasn't just for kings, it was big business for the upper class. Scribes, merchants, priests, even soldiers could be buried with a book of the dead, a cache of amulets, and a list of spiritual contacts that rivaled a modern PR firm. If the old kingdom had buried the few in grand style, the late period buried the many in curated spiritual packages. Still, some people clung to pyramid iconography. Small, steep-sided pyramids were built in cemeteries far from Giza, but these were shadows of the past. Echoes, not declarations. Being buried near one didn't mean you had royal blood. It meant you had taste for nostalgia. It meant you wanted to tap into something ancient, even if it no longer held any real authority. And so, the pyramid, once a celestial launch pad, became a kind of cultural anchor, a recognizable shape, a motif. You might find it etched into a coffin, painted behind a god, or sitting awkwardly atop a local official's tomb like a designer label that didn't quite fit the suit. By this point, the real battleground for the afterlife was no longer stone or architecture. It was belief, ritual, memory. Egypt was surrounded by foreign powers and home to dozens of regional traditions, but the ideology of death remained surprisingly durable. Even as empires rose and fell, the average Egyptian still wanted the same things: protection, recognition, and a safe path through the afterlife's complicated terrain. So was being buried near a pyramid still an honor? That depends. It wasn't about cosmic access anymore, it was about heritage, a nod to a time when the dead were divine and the sky could be climbed by stacking stone. It was less about power and more about legacy, less about belief and more about belonging. The pyramid had become a symbol, not of eternity, but of continuity. And in a civilization constantly reinventing itself, that symbol still carried weight, even if it was hollow inside. By the time the ancient pyramids had become cracked silhouettes against a burning sky, Egypt was no longer ruled by Egyptians alone. Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, they all took a turn holding the crook and flail. But no matter who wore the crown, the urge to reach backward, to channel the image of the past, remained strong. And nothing screamed Egyptian kingship louder than the pyramid, even when its voice had gone hoarse. Small pyramids began sprouting again, especially in Nubia, not as expressions of divine engineering, but as echoes. These new structures mimicked form without function. They were tight, steep, and built more for symbol than soul. The original meaning, the pyramid as a literal bridge between the dead king and the sun god had thinned out. These newer ones were costume jewelry compared to the solid gold of the old kingdom, but still, they meant something. A connection, a claim, a memory made visible in stone. Meanwhile, the actual business of death had grown into a cottage industry. Temples sold access to rituals. Scribes offered package spells. A good embalming was only half the job. What really mattered was how well your name was preserved, how clearly your intentions were written, and whether your burial looked the part. Even the poor could rent prestige. A painted pyramid on a chapel wall might serve as a placeholder for the real thing, a stylized symbol to tell the gods, "I was aiming high." It was marketing through memory. Honor was no longer earned through proximity to royal power. It was simulated through imitation. Being buried near a pyramid didn't guarantee eternal favor. It simply suggested you still remembered what favor used to look like. And yet, the pyramids endured. Weathered, broken, but upright. Like monuments not to immortality, but to the belief in it. People still traced the outlines, still left offerings, still whispered names into the stone. The power was gone, but the silhouette was still doing its job. The Romans didn't build pyramids in Egypt, but they certainly knew how to use them. By the time their legions were marching past the crumbling husks of Giza, those monuments had become tourist traps, mystic backdrops, and symbols of a mystery they couldn't quite crack, but desperately wanted to own. What they saw wasn't just a dead king's tomb. It was a relic of power, a riddle carved in stone, and they wanted to graft its authority onto their own empire. Egypt, now under foreign rule yet again, had shifted from a living kingdom to a curated memory. Greeks had tried to intellectualize the land's secrets. Romans tried to brand them. Emperors visited temples, scribbled their names beside pharaohs, and ordered local priests to keep the rituals going, for show. Not because they believed, but because they knew belief was useful. A sense of continuity sold stability. It made occupation look like inheritance. The pyramids, especially the big ones, stood like ancient influencers, no longer functioning but still attracting attention. Romans left graffiti in the tunnels, carved Latin into chamber walls, and even speculated about hidden knowledge, lost sciences, alien-level engineering. To them, these weren't tombs. They were trophies. Their silence was seductive, their age intoxicating, their mystery exploitable, and the people still being buried nearby? They weren't necessarily honored. They were being positioned. Burials became less about cosmic ascent and more about aesthetic placement. It wasn't about joining a divine king in the stars. It was about having your name etched close to the shadows of greatness. Burial was now a photo op for eternity. The afterlife, meanwhile, was going through its own kind of imperial merger. Egyptian spells mixed with Greco-Roman imagery. Gods blurred into one another. Sarcophagi bore both Anubis and Dionysus. Tombs featured traditional Egyptian forms packed with foreign faces. Identity was flexible now. Belief was curated. A little bit of Osiris, a little bit of Jupiter. Enough incense to evoke legitimacy. Enough Latin to please the Senate. Funerary art adapted too. Scenes of judgment now played out beside Roman-style portraiture. Ba birds hovered next to imperial eagles. The old cosmic system hadn't vanished. It had been rebranded to fit the tastes of overlords who loved the trappings of Egypt, but not its depth. Death became diplomatic. Being buried near a pyramid in this world didn't mean you were part of a sacred legacy. It meant you were part of a legacy that had been staged, diluted, and exported. A pyramid burial was now about optics, about proximity to the idea of ancient power, not the reality of it. To be laid near one was to be photographed by history, not sanctified by it. Roman elites knew the power of the visual. They understood how to borrow grandeur. Some even shipped miniature obelisks back to Rome, lining them up like divine souvenirs. They wanted the presence of the past without the responsibility. Rituals were maintained but hollowed. Forms were preserved but repurposed. To a Roman eye, the pyramid wasn't a stairway to the gods. It was a backdrop for legacy, a platform for ego. And yet, even in this repurposed form, the pyramids continued to command reverence. Not because they still worked, but because no one could quite ignore them. Their scale, their silence, their sheer improbability still sparked a kind of uneasy awe. Even a crumbling monument holds psychological power. Even a hollow symbol can cast a long shadow. The stones still stood, casting those shadows across shifting sands and foreign scripts. But the light hitting them came from a different empire, one that cared more about spectacle than eternity, one that wanted the past not as a guide, but as a prop. Sand covers everything eventually. Walls, roads, names, and even meaning. By the time the Greeks arrived in Egypt, the pyramids were already ancient ruins. Time had peeled away their polished white casing stones. Winds had gnawed at their edges, and stories had outpaced facts. To Greek eyes, these weren't sacred machines of resurrection. They were riddles, strange mathematical feats carved into the desert by a people who worshipped animal-headed gods and entombed their rulers with boats and organs in jars. To the Egyptians who still lived in their shadow, the pyramids remained half-believed memories. They were relics of divine ambition, yes, but also cautionary tales. The pyramids weren't safe. They whispered threats about greed, about forgetting rituals, about what happens when the balance between the living and the dead collapses. Burial near one wasn't about sacred geography anymore. It was about clinging to whatever prestige the past still projected, like dressing in royal robes found in a thrift store. By then, burial culture in Egypt had been absorbed into a broader, murkier system of influences. The Greeks brought new gods, new philosophies, and new power structures, but they couldn't resist the pull of the old stories. Herodotus and others wandered Egypt with open eyes and open notebooks, but they stitched fiction into fact. They called the pyramids tombs built by tyrants. They imagined legions of slaves dragging stones in the heat. They speculated about secret rooms and death traps. They didn't understand what they were looking at, but they turned their confusion into mythology. And that mythology had staying power. The pyramid's original purpose, symbolic resurrection, a stairway to the sun, a frozen prayer for divine fusion, faded under layers of foreign interpretation. But the shape still worked. It inspired awe. It implied mystery. It made people look up and wonder. Even as empires changed and Egypt was folded into the orbit of Hellenistic kings, Roman governors, and later Byzantine Christians, the pyramids stayed rooted. Not because they were still sacred, but because they were too massive to ignore. Meanwhile, the machinery of the afterlife was now broken up into cheap replicas. The spells were still sold, but they came prefabricated. Instead of custom-carved tombs, there were now mass-market coffins. Embalming still happened, but often rushed. Priests performed rites, but for a fee, and sometimes without meaning. Some burial shrouds bore names written in spaces that had obviously been left blank, like a spiritual template, waiting for a customer. In this diluted system, the pyramid was more than a monument. It was a brand, a visual anchor for an identity that no longer existed. Being buried nearby was a way of staging continuity, of asserting relevance. You weren't connecting with cosmic forces, you were participating in performance. It wasn't belief so much as branding by association. You borrowed power from proximity, even if that power had long since faded. But for many, that was still something. In a time of shifting rulers, changing languages, and hollowed-out traditions, the pyramid remained stable. If nothing else, it offered a sense of timelessness. And in death, timelessness is a kind of success. Maybe your name wouldn't last. Maybe your tomb would be robbed. Maybe your rites would be half finished. But if you could be buried near something ancient and undeniable, maybe you'd still be noticed. Maybe you'd still be seen. The afterlife, once an elaborate system of cosmic accountability, had become a shadow of its former self. But the shape of the pyramid still echoed with significance, even if that significance had changed. What was once a ladder to the stars was now a landmark in the sand. And for the last generations of ancient Egyptians, that was enough. In a land of fading gods and reinterpreted myths, sometimes all a person could do was lie quietly beneath the weight of a past too large to carry, and hope to be mistaken for someone who once mattered. There's a moment, late in Egypt's story, when everything starts to blur. Not fade, but smear. Greeks are moving in. Romans are looming. And the line between old ritual and new rule grows increasingly thin. Inside temple walls, priests perform ceremonies first written in ink 1,000 years stale, mumbling the names of gods fewer people believe in. Outside, the world is changing. Empires are churning. New cities are humming with commerce, and old ones are sinking into ruin. Alexandria is rising like a hybrid dream of Athens and Memphis. Ptolemies are marrying their siblings in pharaonic cosplay, rebranding themselves as divine rulers to justify their imported crowns. And the pyramids? They're crumbling under the weight of too many stories. By now, being buried near a pyramid means very little, practically or spiritually. The spells that once animated these massive tombs have unraveled from memory. The rituals are still recited, but their meaning is brittle. What had been a sacred engine of resurrection is now a destination for travelers, a curiosity for scholars, a rock face for graffiti. Greek tourists carve their names beside pharaohs. Roman officials picnic in shadowed chambers. Cleopatra may have styled herself after Isis, but her tomb was never going to be a geometric marvel aligned to the stars. Still, the pyramids persisted, bare, wind-worn, and empty. They no longer spoke. They echoed. The shape became the message. Across the Mediterranean world, miniature pyramids show up in tomb art, urns, and mausoleums, not as acts of devotion, but as aesthetic homage. The pyramid wasn't an access point to the divine anymore. It was branding, a symbol of ancient mystery reduced to silhouette. Meanwhile, traditional Egyptian funerary customs became fully transactional. The temples were still open, but they operated like sacred storefronts. Priests sold bundles of rituals like spiritual insurance policies. You could rent professional mourners to wail at your funeral. You could purchase Book of the Dead scrolls that came pre-written, with blank spaces left for your name. Sarcophagi were mass-produced, lacquered in symbolic paint, but devoid of personal history. Burial had become a shelf of menu options. You didn't earn eternity. You signed up for it like a subscription. The more Egypt was ruled by outsiders, Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the more its native priesthood clung to ritual. But it wasn't just preservation. It was performance, a defensive theater against cultural erosion. They wrapped mummies tighter, etched hieroglyphs deeper, recited spells longer. It wasn't about belief, it was about holding the line. If the world outside was changing, the afterlife had to remain predictable. And yet deep down, the belief had shifted. No one thought a pyramid could launch your soul anymore, not even the priests. What people trusted was the process, the loopholes, the payments, the name dropped in the right litany by the right priest at the right hour. Salvation had become a service economy. Your immortality was someone else's invoice. Even as tombs shrank and spells cheapened, the silhouette of the pyramid loomed in the public psyche. It had been hollowed out, but its profile still meant something. You could sketch one in the sand, and people would understand it stood for something older, bigger, and half forgotten. Honor, too, had changed shape. What was once about being part of the divine machinery of a solar god king was now about proximity to old symbols, not their power. A pyramid-shaped tombstone said, I remember what mattered, even if what mattered had already been lost. The pyramids didn't fall. They eroded into metaphor. They became the scaffolding of memory, the placeholder for a vanished certainty. The desert still holds them, silent triangles under the sun, casting long, shapeless shadows over people who no longer remember why they mattered, only that they once did. Somewhere between sandstorms and fading dynasties, the pyramid became less a tomb and more a rumor. By the time Greek tourists started sketching them and Roman adventurers chipped off souvenirs, the original purpose had already blurred. What had once been sacred architecture, crafted to lift a pharaoh's soul into the sky, was now a backdrop for speculation. Locals still told stories, foreigners imagined secrets, and scholars debated meanings that had long slipped out of memory. But for the most part, the dead had moved on, and so had the rituals. In the shadow of these crumbling triangles, new cemeteries sprang up. Rock-cut tombs, catacombs, and underground chambers replaced the towering ambitions of earlier kings. No one was stacking limestone into holy mountains anymore. The cost was too high, the risk too great, and the mystique too fractured. Still, the rites continued. People prayed, mourned, prepared offerings. But the geometry had shifted. Eternity had downsized. Death became personal again, less of a public monument, more of a private contract with the gods. The pyramid's silhouette lingered like a memory that refused to fade. But the meaning twisted with each retelling. To some, they were relics of wisdom, proof that ancient people once spoke with gods. To others, they were evidence of magic, hidden chambers, lost scrolls, and cosmic knowledge. The symbols etched into the stone had outlived the stories behind them, and so the empty spaces between hieroglyphs filled with guesses and invention. No one remembered the names of most who were buried inside. That anonymity made the monuments feel even larger, timeless, but faceless. Burial near these monuments, once a mark of divine proximity, became a curiosity, a gesture, sometimes a marketing ploy. A Greek noble might choose the site for its atmosphere. A Roman might fund a small shrine with a view of ancient power. Others just wanted to be near what they assumed was the center of the universe. But the connection was cosmetic. The sacred had become scenic. Being close to a pyramid was less about joining the old gods in glory, and more about taking your final rest next to a well-known tourist attraction. Meanwhile, the real afterlife work was being done elsewhere, in crowded city temples, in home altars tucked behind curtains, in imported cults blending Egyptian, Greek, and Roman beliefs. The lines blurred. Anubis stood beside Dionysus. Osiris shared space with Serapis. Isis traveled across the Mediterranean as a goddess of healing, fertility, and magic. The old gods weren't gone, but they had become flexible, more fluid, more inclusive. They weren't gatekeepers anymore. They were consultants, spiritual freelancers in a world with shifting loyalties. Tombs now came in all sizes and styles. Some were elaborate, lined with painted gods and inscribed spells. Others were simple, marked by a jar or a name scratched into stone. The afterlife became something you negotiated through ritual packages. You could hire priests to recite your name on festival days, pay for a scroll with a standard set of protective spells. If you were lucky, or wealthy, you might get something custom, but often, eternity was built from what you could afford, not what you believed. And the pyramid? It kept standing, refusing to collapse completely. A monument without a monarch. A kingless kingdom of stone. Its once blinding limestone casing had been stripped away, repurposed, scavenged. But the shape endured. Its silence echoed. People stood in its shadow and swore they felt something. Power, mystery, dread. Long after its function had died, its image survived. A symbol stripped of purpose, but not of influence. So people still came, to bury, to wonder, to pretend. Some came to be seen. Others came to remember or imagine what being close to greatness might feel like, because even a hollow monument can cast a long shadow. And sometimes that shadow is enough to believe in, not because the pyramid still held answers, but because the questions never stopped. A body wrapped in linen lies still in the desert silence, but the world around it is anything but quiet. In Ptolemaic Egypt, death had become an intersection of cultures, Greek rationalism and Egyptian ritual holding hands, not always willingly. The pyramids? Still there, dusty, faded, looming reminders of a past no one could quite let go of. Their silhouettes still pierced the horizon, but their purpose had unraveled. What had once been cosmic launch pads were now archaeological landmarks, misread, reimagined, and repurposed for a new generation, unsure whether to fear them, honor them, or commercialize them. For some, being buried near these ancient structures was an act of imitation. For others, it was superstition, echoing a belief that perhaps proximity to the old power could rub off, like standing in the fading warmth of a fire long extinguished. And for a few, it was branding, a final selfie with a monument to make death feel important, meaningful, curated. Greek elites took Egyptian names and commissioned tombs shaped by foreign hands. Egyptians sculpted statues in Greek styles and quoted Plato next to Osiris. The lines blurred. Identity wasn't sacred. It was strategic. Priests continued rituals they barely understood anymore, more out of habit than conviction, chanting words they no longer spoke in everyday life, lighting incense whose meaning had drifted, drawing protective symbols with the same precision but less faith. It was all theater now. Even mummification, once a sacred craft tied to myth and resurrection, had become a boutique industry. It didn't go away, it got stylized. Sarcophagi bore Greek facial features with Roman hairstyles. Amulets included symbols from multiple traditions. Spells were still written, but now they shared space with Hellenistic motifs, borrowed gods, and ideas about the soul shaped more by Aristotle than Anubis. The old Egyptian vision of the afterlife, the field of reeds, the weighing of the heart, the trial before the 42 judges, was still whispered, still painted in tombs, but it lived in the margins. It quietly competed with new ideas of judgment, rebirth, and memory imported from Athens and Alexandria. The two worlds overlapped like layers of sand, never quite mixing, always shifting. Burial near a pyramid during this time didn't say, "I serve the divine king." It said, "I remember something sacred, even if I don't fully understand it." It was more gesture than faith. The pyramid had become a prop in a cultural stage play, its power symbolic, its meaning blurred. Still impressive, still massive, but hollow in both structure and intent. Some tombs echoed the style of ancient ones. False doors, carved in soft limestone, painted gods posed mid-ritual, protective spells copied word for word from older texts. But everything felt thinner now, more performative. Death had become a ritual of nostalgia. The real spiritual weight was gone. People weren't connecting to cosmic architecture. They were posing next to it, draping themselves in echoes of meaning, hoping it would stick. And yet, even in this diluted form, the pyramid still cast a shadow. Maybe not one of divine power, but of endurance, a ghost of eternity. And in a time when empires shifted like desert dunes, Persians, Greeks, Romans, all leaving their own stamp, even the illusion of permanence was worth paying for. People bought their burial plots not with conviction, but with the hope that something from the past might still carry weight. Maybe it would protect them. Maybe it would make them matter. The pyramid, once a machine for the soul's ascension, was now a relic in a spiritual museum, one where the lights flickered, the labels were rewritten, and the guides spoke with accents foreign to the stone. But it still stood. That was its trick. And in a world where nothing stayed the same, That was almost enough. Sand covers most mistakes eventually. That was the quiet gamble ancient Egyptians made, not just with their monuments, but with the ideologies baked into them. Theirs was a civilization that built with permanence in mind, but forgot how quickly memory can rot when culture shifts. By the time Greeks were walking the streets of Memphis, asking questions about ibis-headed gods and crocodile cults, the pyramids had shifted fully into the realm of myth. They were no longer tombs. They were relics. Ruins, yes, but also oversized props in a grand, decaying theater where the original cast had long vanished and no one remembered the script. The locals still told stories, but they weren't the same stories. Herodotus came through, notebook in hand, eager to gather ancient wisdom, and what he found was part folklore, part satire. The priests fed him tales half sincere, half performative. The real function of the pyramids, cosmic engines, royal staging grounds, ideological blueprints, had been replaced by riddles and rumors. Nobody was building them anymore. Nobody could. The techniques were hazy, the purpose even more so. And yet the idea of them, those impossible triangles stabbing the sky, still carried weight. Not the spiritual gravitas they once held, but something else. Something like cultural gravity, a memory shaped in stone. The Ptolemies, Greek rulers performing as pharaohs for an Egyptian audience, understood the marketing potential. They posed with the pyramids on coins. They staged rituals nearby, not because they believed in the old divine geometry, but because their subjects remembered it. They knew that symbolism could stretch further than sincerity. But they didn't dare revive pyramid construction. Instead, they invested in temples, massive, ornate complexes like those at Dendera and Edfu, where the blueprints of the past were copied with eerie precision. These were temples built by people trying to speak a dead language, phonetically. Their craftsmanship was sincere. Their ideology, decaffeinated. Those temples were part of a broader trend, an attempt to rehearse Egyptian power by copying its forms. But the pyramid, that was too loaded, too lost. You don't resurrect a god by rebuilding its statue. You just keep pointing at the ruins and telling stories. And the pyramid became the ultimate story, one everyone knew, but no one could finish. Meanwhile, the machinery of burial had changed entirely. The sacred economy of death had industrialized. Mummification became almost cookie-cutter. Sarcophagi were turned out like furniture. Spells could be purchased in pre-written scrolls. One size fits most instructions for the journey through the underworld. The afterlife had become accessible to more people, but the awe was gone. What had once been bespoke was now bulk-ordered. There were still tombs, still rituals, but they were diluted by repetition. If you ended up interred near a pyramid in this time, it wasn't because you were sacred. It was because you, or someone who paid for you, wanted a little reflected glory, proximity to legend, a kind of dusty nostalgia, like being buried next to a monument your great-great-grandparents believed in. And the pyramids loomed, not as temples, not as spiritual hubs, but as stubborn geography. They were weathered, gutted, stripped of their facing stones and internal treasures. Their names were still known, but barely. They weren't honored so much as endured, massive, immovable reminders of how far Egypt had drifted from its own myth. Some still feared them. Curses carved deep into blocks had taken on new life in local imagination. Even if people no longer understood the language of the old gods, they still respected the threat. You didn't mess with a pyramid, not out of reverence, but out of superstition. It was like touching the bones of a giant. You just didn't. In the end, being buried in a pyramid wasn't about privilege anymore. It was about myth maintenance, legacy management, less transcendence, more branding. You weren't ascending to the stars. You were filing yourself into the background noise of history, an echo of someone else's echo, a last-ditch effort to stay relevant in a system that had already forgotten its own passwords. And if the wind blew hard enough, the sand would bury that effort too. The pyramid would still be there. Your name, maybe not. A hot wind cuts across the desert, whistling through cracks in a tomb wall that no one's visited in centuries. The stone is worn smooth by time, inscriptions half faded like half-remembered prayers, and the pyramid nearby slumps into itself, a once mighty shape softened by erosion and indifference. This used to be sacred ground. It used to buzz with ritual and presence. Now it's mostly silence, scattered bones and sand shifting without purpose. By the tail end of ancient Egyptian civilization, burial had become a strange mix of ritual muscle memory and hollow theater. People still went through the motions, mummifying bodies, chanting the old incantations, aligning tombs to echo celestial rhythms. But the soul of the thing had drained away. The system that once promised transcendence had become a tradition people followed because they didn't know how to stop. Egypt had passed through too many hands. Libyans, Nubians, Persians, Macedonians, Romans. The language shifted, the gods were rebranded, the rules rewritten, but the funerary rituals marched on like a religion kept alive out of habit. And yet, through all of this, the pyramid endured, not as a divine machine, not as a stairway to the afterlife, but as a relic too iconic to fully abandon. Some late tombs still mimicked the shape in miniature. Some temples still quoted its geometry in their hymns. It had gone from being a functioning part of the divine order to something more like a sacred fossil, revered but misunderstood, honored but inert. No one really believed a pyramid would launch your soul into the stars anymore, but it still stood, and so it still mattered. The people burying their dead in these twilight centuries were hedging their bets. A little bit of everything went into the tomb. Spells copied from several time periods, amulets for Ra, for Isis, for Osiris, sometimes all at once. You'd see Greek-style sarcophagi painted with Egyptian gods. You'd find pyramid-shaped chapels facing west when tradition said east. The iconography was there, but scrambled. The belief was diluted. Funerary culture had become more collage than conviction. Burial wasn't about certainty anymore. It was about covering all bases, a spiritual shotgun approach, just in case. You might be judged by Osiris. You might be judged by someone else. You might have to fight a snake in the underworld, or sail across a river of fire, or simply fade into non-existence. Better to pack everything and hope at least one spell worked. Being placed near a pyramid in these final centuries wasn't about prestige or divine proximity. It was about nostalgia, a longing for the power those monuments once symbolized, a way to stage a connection to the distant past, even if that past had stopped caring. The structure loomed as it always had, but now it was mostly background noise, something the living could look at and say, "We were once great," while knowing deep down that they no longer understood the greatness they were referencing. Still, someone came here. Someone placed the body. Someone traced the name into limestone, lit the incense, whispered the same prayers that had been spoken for 2,000 years. Even in decline, Egypt didn't stop honoring its dead. It just ran out of reasons to believe the old system still worked. The rituals kept happening, but the magic felt like it had checked out long ago. The pyramid remained. Not active, not sacred, just present, just there. A monument to a time when death was the beginning of something vast and divine, and now just a reminder that even eternity can age, crumble, and get forgotten in the sand. And yet, the idea didn't die. It lingered. It clung to memory. Because for all the decay, for all the disbelief, there's something irresistible about the promise of forever, even when you suspect it's a lie. The wind had changed direction. It no longer moved through royal necropolises with awe. It sifted through ruins, shifting sand over collapsed corridors and forgotten gods. Egypt wasn't dead, but it wasn't ruling anymore. It had become a memory of itself, preserved in fragments, studied by conquerors, and walked upon by cultures that saw its relics more as curiosities than sacred monuments. Time had rebranded Egypt from a world power to a romantic ruin. Its monuments were no longer tools of statecraft. They were photo opportunities for travelers with scrolls and sketchbooks. By the time the Greeks rolled in, the pyramids were already ancient, 20 centuries old and counting. Alexander admired them, saw them as proof of a land that had once commanded the stars. The Ptolemies, Greek rulers in Egyptian clothing, tried to tap into that magic. They styled themselves as pharaohs, made offerings to old gods, and even kept the temple priests paid. Barely. But it was performance, a carefully calculated costume. No one truly understood what the pyramids had meant. Not anymore. They stood like echoes, massive, weathered, mysterious. Locals lived in their shadow without really knowing their original purpose. Foreigners marveled, theorized, stole pieces, made drawings. The meaning of the pyramid was now up for interpretation. Equal parts myth, misreading, and misunderstanding. Reverence had faded. The power had bled out. Being buried near a pyramid by this point was like asking to be buried next to a monument in a country you didn't quite belong to. It was proximity to mystery, not divinity. A kind of spatial superstition. Maybe being near these ancient bones would lend your soul some kind of bonus credit. Maybe the gods, or what was left of them, were still paying attention. Or maybe it was just about being seen trying. Even as belief systems shifted, the illusion of connection to the past held its own kind of power, and people leaned into that illusion. Wealthy Alexandrians commissioned tombs with stylized pyramid shapes. Roman officials buried in Egyptian soil requested painted pyramid motifs on their sarcophagi. It wasn't belief in the pyramid's mechanics. It was belief in its aura. Even stripped of meaning, it radiated significance, like a lighthouse whose light no longer turned, but still stood tall on the shore. The old inscriptions were fading. Sandstone crumbled. Paint peeled off burial chamber walls. Statues once worshipped were now souvenirs or museum specimens in waiting, but the iconography refused to die. People still copied the forms. You could see tiny pyramids rise over Greek-influenced tombs or appear in Roman mosaics. They had become aesthetic, decorative death, symbols stripped of operational power, like wearing a crown after the monarchy has been abolished, a statement of alignment with something ancient, even if its blueprint had long been lost. The pyramid's purpose had once been cosmic architecture, a device for transforming a king into a star. Now, it was mostly scenery, romantic, ruined, half buried in its own mythology. A backdrop for stories about greatness, even if those stories were fogged with fiction. And still, there were those who thought that maybe, just maybe, lying down in the shadow of one could get you noticed in the next world. The afterlife had grown murky. The gods' addresses had changed. But some still left their names in the sand, hoping for delivery. But there were no guarantees. The old gods weren't answering. The old pathways weren't marked. No priest could recite the full rituals anymore. The spells had fragmented. The pyramid had become a landmark for the lost, a relic of systems no longer understood, and hopes no longer defined by doctrine, but by nostalgia. And yet people kept showing up with chisels and prayers, hoping that a little bit of the old magic might still be buried somewhere under the dust. Maybe not in the stone, but in the idea. That something powerful had once happened here. That, by standing close enough to it, you might catch the echo. You might still matter. That was the new belief system. Not salvation through ritual, but redemption through proximity. And the pyramid, hollowed and crumbling, still held enough shape to play along. They were still carving tombs when the Romans arrived. By then, the pyramids had long since given up their secrets. Their polished limestone exteriors had been chipped away, scavenged for other building projects, and their shadowy interiors had been emptied out by tomb robbers and treasure hunters generations earlier. The sacred geometry that once pointed toward the heavens now sat dulled by wind and time. They no longer served as launch pads for divine kingship. They had become landmarks for memory, silent witnesses to a time when the dead were gods, and stone could speak. When Rome folded Egypt into its empire, the spiritual core of Egyptian identity didn't disappear. It fractured, dispersed, and clung to the rituals that had always been there. Roman-era Egyptians walked a line between two worlds. They wore togas, filled temples with Latin inscriptions, and bowed to emperors who ruled from distant capitals. But when they prepared their dead, they reached for linen wrappings, funerary amulets, and spells that had been copied and recopied since before Julius Caesar was born. They mummified their loved ones, placed sacred items in tombs, and paid priests to recite ancient rites. Death, to them, was still an Egyptian business. If you had wealth and influence in those final centuries, you might even afford a tomb designed in a vaguely pyramidal form, short, steep-sided, often made of mud brick or sandstone. These structures weren't meant to function as cosmic tools. They were symbols, placeholders for a glory long gone. A flat-roofed tomb with a triangular facade could gesture toward divine authority without making any claims of it. They were more homage than infrastructure, more nostalgic nod than spiritual innovation. The pyramid itself had shifted from object of worship to cultural artifact. In some cases, it had become decoration. Painted scenes in Roman period tombs sometimes included pyramids as backdrops, like props in a stage play. They signified ancient Egypt, the way a colonnade might now signify Rome. Priests adapted too. They blended Greco-Roman philosophies into their old theology, creating strange, beautiful hybrids. Anubis might appear with Hermes in a protective spell. Isis might be invoked using Platonic logic. These weren't contradictions. They were survival mechanisms. Belief adapting to empire. What remained consistent was the desire for permanence. Egyptians still feared being forgotten. They still inscribed names onto stone. They still buried Shabti figurines to serve them in the afterlife. And they still feared judgment. Even as the gods changed names and faces, the rituals of burial remained deeply familiar. To be buried near a pyramid in this era meant something different than it once had. It meant aligning yourself with memory, with legacy, with a brand of immortality no longer promised, but still deeply envied. It was like buying property next to a broken cathedral, not because it functioned, but because it reminded everyone who passed by that once someone had touched the divine. The desert did what deserts do. It covered, it preserved, and it whispered. Bones wrapped in faded linen still lay under sand and rock. Names that hadn't been spoken aloud in centuries still clung to the walls of broken tombs. The pyramids, stripped of meaning but not mystery, stood nearby, silent, observing, enduring. They didn't protect the dead anymore, but they remembered where they were laid. Burial, even in decline, was still sacred. The rituals still mattered. The journey still required guidance. But the pyramid? It had become a relic of ambition, a visual echo of a promise no longer kept. And yet, those who built near it still hoped. Maybe not for eternity, maybe not for divine transformation, but for recognition, for continuity, for the chance that even if the gods no longer listened, the neighbors still might. Somewhere beneath a bleached sky and the crackle of wind against sunburned stone, a half-buried limestone block still holds the chisel marks of a man who was never meant to be remembered. He wasn't a pharaoh or a noble, or even a priest. He had no cartouche, no statues, no titles inscribed in ink or stone. He was one of the thousands, tens of thousands, who hauled eternity into shape, block by block, swing by swing, day after blistering day, and he died before his job was done. His burial? Not inside a pyramid, not near one, not even within ceremonial distance. He was tucked into the sand at the edge of a workers' village, wrapped in reused linen, laid beside a pot, a bead, and maybe a crude shabti meant to serve him in the afterlife. If the spell worked, if the name was remembered, if the gods were still paying attention. He had no tomb inscription, no elaborate coffin. His name may never have been written down, and still, he's the reason this whole story matters. For all the grandeur, gold, and divine language of the pyramids, their truth was always exclusionary. These were monuments not to a shared eternity, but to centralized power. They weren't communal burial grounds. They were singular statements. One person, one afterlife, one engineered narrative in stone. And beneath that elite destiny lay a foundation literally built on unacknowledged labor. The pyramid was never for the many. It was for the few. And sometimes, in the end, not even for them. The workers lived in tight quarters within walled labor camps, part village, part control mechanism. Their days were counted in rations of bread and beer. Their muscles broke down under scaffolding, their backs bent over transport sledges, their fingers blistered on copper chisels that dulled faster than hope. Their lives were governed by quotas and overseers, temple accountants and foremen who recited the pharaoh's will as law. And still, every block carried a bit of them. Their sweat, their pain, and the knowledge that what they were building was a gate they themselves would never pass through. And yet, they believed, somehow, in the justice of Ma'at, in the judgment of the heart, in the promise that death could be managed, bargained with, scripted, and recited into submission. Maybe their scratched prayers on pottery shards, their home-carved amulets, their whispered spells in the dark would be enough. Maybe just believing was enough. The pyramid didn't honor them. It ignored them. But their fingerprints remain, pressed invisibly into the joints between blocks, ground into the dust between foundation layers, worn into the thresholds. They weren't given eternity, but they helped shape the illusion of it for someone else. Their legacy is anonymous and everywhere. Every gleaming capstone and polished casing once projected divine perfection, but inside every monument is hollow. Every sarcophagus, however elaborate, is surrounded by silence. The memory preserved inside belongs to one man. The memory erased outside belongs to thousands. This is the part no inscription tells you. Egypt's grand architecture is not history. It's intention, a curated version of events. Every polished wall is a monologue. Every relief is propaganda carved to convince both gods and people that divine order was working, that the king was eternal, that the system was right. But history whispers a different story. The bones outside the monuments tell it. So do the unmarked graves, the reused tombs, the half-finished carvings abandoned when funding or favor ran out. The idea of the pyramid as sacred destiny collapses when you realize how many destinies it consumed without recording. So when you look at a pyramid today, whether from afar, in a book, or with sand in your shoes, remember this. It's not just what was buried inside that matters. It's who was left outside. It's whose stories didn't get carved in stone. It's the reminder that memory is a choice, and so is forgetting. And the pyramid? It forgets by design. A sandstorm doesn't care what's buried beneath it. That's the truth Egypt learned the hard way. Over centuries, the wind didn't just move sand. It moved memory. It carved down monuments, blurred once crisp hieroglyphs, swept away the colors that once dazzled in the sunlight, and erased names that had once held enough weight to command armies and shape the cosmos. Entire cemeteries vanished beneath dunes, and with them, the promises those graves were built to guarantee. The pyramid wasn't spared. It cracked. It faded. Its smooth casing stones were stolen, its burial chambers breached, and its meaning diluted. The sharpness of its lines dulled, and with it the force of its message, the unshakable power of divine kingship. Yet even as the desert reclaimed the land, people kept returning to the pyramids. They dug around their bases, set up shrines in their shadows, and in some cases chose to be buried beside them. Not because the pyramids still worked in the metaphysical sense. No one believed they were launching souls into the sky anymore, but because they had once worked. They had once held that sacred energy, that undeniable gravity. And that's the thing about symbols. Even when they lose function, they rarely lose influence. Being buried near a pyramid in these later years was like choosing to live next to the ruins of a fortress. You weren't safe because of it, but you hoped some of the old strength still clung to the stone. That kind of faith wasn't about belief. It was about association, memory, legacy, nostalgia. By this point in history, the afterlife had become something transactional. There was a standard script, and if you followed it, you could buy your place in eternity, or at least lease it. Spells were mass copied onto rolls of papyrus, often with blank spaces for names. Tomb workers carved the same scenes over and over, adjusting only the titles. Sarcophagi were passed down, resold, even reinscribed. Sacred and practical blurred into each other. Some graves were prepared with intense devotion, curated like personal altars. Others were more like bureaucratic checklists, wrapping, box, name tag, done. The rituals of death had become industrialized. Still, the old stones whispered. Even after their power had waned, the pyramids pulled at the imagination. Pilgrims visited them. Locals passed down legends. New rulers, some native, some foreign, claimed kinship with the ancient kings by restoring or appropriating pyramid sites. The structures no longer guaranteed anything metaphysical, but they still carried weight in a cultural sense. Everyone wanted to borrow the gravity of the past, even if they weren't sure it still meant something. The pyramid, in its ruined state, was like a broken relic on display, stripped of use, but not of story. The truth was, a pyramid didn't need to function anymore. It didn't need to be a stairway to the heavens or a power station for the soul. Its value was no longer rooted in religious certainty. It was about the echo, the image, the implication that once, right here, humanity touched the divine, or at least tried to. That was its power now, not sacred utility, but cultural inertia. You didn't get buried near a pyramid to ascend. You got buried near one so people might think you were part of something bigger, older, more permanent than you actually were. In a time when everything else had become uncertain, who ruled, which gods were in favor, how long the Nile would flood, that echo was enough. Enough to build around. Enough to die beside. Enough to justify one last attempt at mattering. By then, even a whisper from the past felt like something worth clinging to. And that whisper still traveled through stone, even when the wind screamed louder. The desert doesn't forget, but it doesn't remember kindly either. What once gleamed white under the sun now sits broken and sand-choked, its geometry fractured, its meaning scattered across time like shattered myths. The pyramids, those impossible, angular promises, still rise above the horizon, but they speak more in silence than in scripture now. Their voices have faded into the wind, carried off grain by grain with each storm that scrapes their flanks. Once, they were the very language of divine kingship, not just tombs, but declarations. The stones screamed divinity, permanence, godhood on earth. But today, they're background noise in a world that moved on. Farmers plow near their bases without looking up. Tourists take selfies, unaware of the stories buried beneath their feet. The wind carves its own hieroglyphs into ancient blocks. And yet, they linger. These blunt monuments to belief, to control, to the fantasy that death could be conquered by design. For centuries, the idea was painfully simple. Proximity meant prestige. The closer you were to the pyramid, the closer you were to power, eternal power, sanctioned by gods and guaranteed by geometry. But like every system built on hierarchy and illusion, it eroded from within. What started as sacred quickly became strategic. What was once divine became political. Burials multiplied, meanings diluted. Space ran out. Intent gave way to imitation. Imitation turned to habit. And the habit turned hollow. Some were buried in hopes of basking in the pharaoh's eternal light, hoping his holiness might rub off. Others were buried because they were useful. Advisors, scribes, priests. Some were placed there as rewards, tokens of favor. Others, to fulfill obligations that extended beyond the grave, to serve, to guard, to labor forever. Even in death, Egypt ran on labor, loyalty, and ledger books. Death didn't cancel your role. It extended your shift. There were entire industries built around these burials. Tomb architects, craftsmen, ritual specialists. People who never touched the afterlife themselves but shaped its pathways for others. Even funerary texts were copied en masse. The pyramid might have stood alone, but it cast a shadow of enterprise. Spiritual, bureaucratic, and often transactional. And yet, for all its shifting purposes, the pyramid never stopped being a symbol. Even now, stripped of function, it holds weight. Maybe not spiritual, maybe not sacred, but undeniable. Like a signature scratched into the earth, like a brand name faded but never forgotten. They're placeholders for a promise no one quite believes in anymore, but no one's ready to discard. Being buried near a pyramid wasn't always an honor. Sometimes it was a convenience. Sometimes it was politics. Sometimes it was simply the result of being born into the right or wrong moment in history. The closer you got, the more complicated it became. Some used the location to elevate themselves. Others were placed there to be kept close, controlled, even silenced. Still, even among the cracked tombs and looted chambers, the names remain. Names whispered into time. Names etched into stone, into clay, into papyrus that barely survived the centuries. Names remembered not because they were grand, but because someone, somewhere, thought they were worth writing down. It didn't matter if the soul rose to the field of reeds or was lost in the underworld. What mattered was that they were recorded, and that's what survives in the end. Not the power, not the gold, not the honor, just the echo of intention, sealed in sand and silence, a monument to what people hoped for, feared, and tried to control, a stone broadcast to eternity, now barely a whisper, but still there, still standing, still watching.